We're in the middle of a series called Heroes of the Faith. There actually is a Hall of Fame in the New Testament. It's the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. It's a great chapter. It talks about the great people of faith, and they're all listed in there. I find it very interesting when you get into Hebrews chapter 11. In verse 6, it says this, that without faith, it is impossible to please God. That's why there's a whole chapter just dedicated to people who live their life by faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. You know, I hear people say all the time, how are Old Testament saints saved? They were saved by keeping the law, right? They kept the Ten Commandments. And the answer is no. No, nobody lived up to the law from that standpoint. The law was there to show us that we were sinners. Let me tell you something. People were saved in the Old Testament the same way they're saved in the New Testament. How about that? How are they saved in the New Testament? They're saved by grace through faith. Through faith. There it is once again. You look at the life of Noah. He was a man of faith. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He lived by faith. We're not going to deal with Noah in Hebrews 11, but he worked by faith. What if God called you to a job that took 120 years? 120 years, and he labored there 120 years and did it in faith. It never rained before, but God said there was going to be a cataclysmic problem up on the earth, that he was going to flood the entire earth, and he built the boat. And so we see that in Noah. But without faith, it is impossible to please God. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:9, he says, I make it my aim. Matter of fact, I make it my ambition. One translation says. Another one says, I make it my goal. And here it is. My goal, my aim, my ambition is to please God. To please God. Think about that. That was his goal. That's exactly what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. It says, without faith, it's impossible to please God. So if you're going to please God, Paul says he made that his goal. And he tells us how he did that 2 verses earlier. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says 2 verses earlier, we walk by faith, not by, you know the rest of it? We walk by faith, not by sight. By sight. And so we please God when we live by faith. And faith, bottom line, as we've been looking at this, we understand that faith is taking God at his word. God said it, and that settles it. We take God at his word. That's what faith is all about. And so we began looking at the great heroes of faith. We looked at Abel, who it says, who offered a more excellent sacrifice. And how did he do it? He did it by faith. He did it by faith. He did exactly what God told him. People wonder, why would God reject Cain's offering? He didn't act according to what God said. And it's interesting because the very first person he mentions is Abel, and it's an aspect of worship and how you worship God. Some people say, well, you can worship God any way you want to as long as you're sincere. Is that true? You worship any way you want to as long as you're sincere. That's all that matters. No, that's not what it matters. If you look at what Jesus said to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, he said this, if you worship God, those that worship him must, two things, worship him in spirit and in truth. Worship in spirit and truth. What is truth? It's the word of God. It's the word of God. Taking God at his word. Taking God at his word. And so Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice by taking God at his word. Matter of fact, if you look at the sacrifice that he gave, it was the best. It wasn't just some hand-me-down that Cain had given and God had rejected it. So we saw that worship has to be according to faith, taking God at his word. Then last week we looked at Enoch, and I love Enoch because he's in the family genealogy. I don't know if you saw who Enoch's father was. Anybody see Enoch's father? His name was Jared. Isn't that cool? My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, whatever, Jared. And then Jared was begat Enoch. Enoch had a son by the name of Methuselah. And by the way, if it wasn't for Methuselah, Jared would have been the longest living person ever. But because of the grace of God, Methuselah lived to be the longest. If you went home and did the math, you found out, when did Methuselah die? He died the year of the flood. And what's interesting, his name means this, Methuselah. When he is gone, then it shall come. And God had said something to Enoch, and Enoch walked with God after that. Matter of fact, he's one of the guys, there's 2 guys in the Bible that never died. He's one of them. God just said one night, you want to come home? He said, I'd love that. He said, well, come on home. And he took him to heaven. And that happened by faith. There's another guy. Anybody remember the other guy that went to heaven without dying? Yeah, Elijah. You got Elijah and you got Enoch. Some people believe that in the tribulation, there'll be the 2 prophets who come back and speak for the cause of God. But it's interesting. We see 2 guys. One worshiped God by faith, Abel, and then we see one who walked with God. He walked with God by faith, and that was Enoch. Today, I want to look at is David. I want to look at David. It's interesting in Hebrews chapter 11. after he starts revealing all these different people of faith, he says this in verse 32, and what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and of Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions. Now, we're going to look today at a guy by the name of David, and it's here in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Let's go to school on David. Did I say Daniel? I'm sorry. David. Let's go to school on David. And here, it's interesting because he's mentioned in the Hall of Fame of faith. And he was one of those guys who subdued kingdoms. David was a warrior. He was a fighter. And he fought by faith. He lived his life by faith. And here in 1 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to be introduced to a problem that David had to deal with. Matter of fact, everybody knows this story. But I think they missed the principles of what this is all about. It's a great story. It's the story of David and Goliath. David and Goliath. And so what about David and Goliath? We kind of know that. It's like an underdog facing this mighty power or something like that. I don't want you to miss the principles that are involved in this passage here. Let's talk about, first of all, the reality of the problem in this passage. The reality of the problem. By the way, we have problems all the time, don't we? You can summarize problems up in two categories. There's physical problems and there's spiritual problems. And it's interesting, this guy who comes before them is going to be both. I want you to notice what it says, the reality of the problem. Look what it says in chapter 17, verse 1. It says, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle. These were the enemy, and they're gathering their armies. They're coming up against the nation of Israel. They gathered their armies for battle. Look what it says in verse 2, the very first part of that. It says, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together. So you got the Philistines and you have the Israelites. And then notice what it says in verse 3. Then the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. They're getting ready to go to battle. You got Philistines over here, you got Israel over here. There's a valley in between, okay? We're gonna have a war right here. We're gonna have a battle. We're gonna have a fight. And this was constant. As long as Israel was in the land, there were people that said, you don't deserve to be in this land, and they wanted to run them out. And so they're faced with a problem. And we're going to find out in this passage, it was a big problem. It was a big problem. Look what he says in the very next verse, in verse 4. It says, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and the shield bearer went before him. Now, when I read this, I think what we have to do is address the problem. If you're dealing with struggles and battles, God's going to tell you to act by faith. And to act in faith, first of all, you got to know the problem that you're up against. And so we just read this, but the only thing is, in our, Western culture, we don't measure things by cubits or by shekels. Anybody know what this means right here? I was looking at this trying to figure out, what's this mean? How big is he? I mean, some people have all kinds of ideas how big. They say he's a giant. He's a giant. Well, after a little research, it's interesting. A cubit is basically 18 inches. That's how big a cubit is. Not only is a cubit 18 inches, a span, he says he was 6 cubits and a span. A span is half of a cubit. It's 9 inches. All right? So I started doing a little calculating there. And when you calculate it all up, Goliath is 117 inches. Does that make you shake in your boots? What's 117 inches? 117 inches is almost 10 feet tall. He's 9 feet, 9 inches. Now, friend, just his physical appearance brought fear to them. 9 feet, 9 inches. It was a big problem. As a matter of fact, not only was it 9 feet, look at what it says about him. He had a bronze helmet, and on his head he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. Basically, it's 125 pounds. That was his jacket, 125 pounds. Wow. It goes on. Look what he says in verse 7. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Basically, his spear, the head on his spear, check this out, was 15 pounds. He's wearing a jacket that's 125 pounds. He has a spearhead that's 15 pounds. Have you ever tried to throw 15 pounds? You ever try to do that? You ever try to pick up a weight and throw it and stuff? See how far you can throw it? Anybody ever run track before? In track, they got, for something, if you're not that real fast, they got other events you can do, right? They have other things to let you know that you're loved and cared for, but there are other things you can try out for. I remember I went out for track. I was one of those kids. I got cut from the basketball team because I couldn't touch the net. Couldn't touch the net. I was 5'2". If I could touch the net, I'd be in the NBA today right there if I was 5'2", right? I mean, 5'2", I got cut because I couldn't touch the net. Well, anyways, I went out for the track team. And it's interesting, when I went out for the track team, I found out that I was slow too. I was real slow. So they had other things you could do, all right? One of the things you could do was pole vault, and I thought that would be cool. Pole vaulting? That's what I wanted. I want to be a pole vaulter, all right? And everybody knows what pole vaulting is? It's where you take this pole and you put it in there and you run as fast as you can, and you hit it and you go over it, right? I'd seen that before, but when I first learned to do it, as I was running, I'd hit it and I'd hold on to it. Doggone it, if they just moved that thing, I could really get some height, right? But that's how I hit it. I hit it as hard as I could, and I just hold on to it because there was something in the back of my head that said, you have to be crazy to hit that thing and then throw your legs up because here's going to be me. And not make it all the way over. I remember the first time I ever did it, I was so excited. I was so excited. I noticed there was another thing that was involved, though, in track and field. It was a thing called shot put. Anybody know what shot put is? Yeah. It's a ball that they take, and that ball, they sit there, and they have to shoot the ball. You know how heavy it was? Check this out. It's the same weight as this spearhead, 15 pounds. 15 pounds. Anybody ever see one travel more than 30 or 40 yards, 50 yards to shot? No. I mean, the world record is not even close to that even and stuff. But it's interesting. This is the guy who they're up against, who they're going into battle. It was a big problem. Not only was it a big problem, it was a persistent problem that they were facing. Look what it says in verse 16 of this chapter. It says, and the Philistines drew near and presented himself 40 days, mornings and evening. He was there every morning, every evening. It was persistent. He came out. I mean, here's Israel on one side, Philistines on the other, and in the valley, here is Goliath with his shield bearer that comes before them. Matter of fact, in this problem, I want you to notice what he said to them. Look what it says in verse 8. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself and let him come down to me. And if he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that I may fight, that we may fight together. That was every day, twice a day for 40 days. This problem wasn't going away. You just can't ignore it. I mean, they're there to battle, and lo and behold, they bring out this warrior. I mean, this guy, nobody's seen anybody this tall before or this big, and taking a look at his armor and standing there before him. And this is overwhelming. But don't forget, this is the people of God. This is the people of God. They got a lot of lessons they can look back and see how God had delivered them. And here they are in this incredible battle, getting ready to go in a fight. And in here, I want you to see the reaction to the problem. The reaction to the problem. Look what he says in verse 11. It says, then Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were enraged and ready to fight. What do you think? Is that what your translation says? No, it doesn't say that, does it? I mean, that's what I would expect. I mean, this is the people of God they're going up against. And he comes out and defies the nation of Israel. And when he defies the nation of Israel, you would think they'd be ready to fight. Let's do this. We're going to fight. We're going to win this for the Lord. No. Look what it says. When they heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's the army. Those are the ones that are supposed to go into battle. This is the one that's supposed to deal with the solution, the problem. Matter of fact, look what it says. It gets worse. Look at verse 24 of the same chapter. Just look a little further down. It says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man. That's interesting. When they saw the man. Let me ask you something. How are they walking? We walk by faith, not by. Let's try that one more time. We walk by faith, not by. In fact, let's kind of get a sight right here. Why don't you guys do the faith right here? We're going to get you guys to do the sight, right? All right? We walk by faith, not by sight. That's pretty good. Try that one more time, right? We walk by faith, not by sight. Yeah. Nation of Israel is walking by sight. They weren't pleasing God. It's interesting. If you're going to please God, you have to go by faith and take God at his word. And here they are. God had given them the promised land. It was theirs to be able to dwell in. And here we are. They're going to battle, and they're fearful and afraid. Matter of fact, they're dreadfully afraid. Dreadfully afraid. Well, we see Israel, they were fearful. They were fearful. Why? Because they were walking by sight rather than by faith. Well, we see Israel. How about, where's Saul at? I mean, Saul was the guy that should be out there, right? He should be the one that's going into battle. I mean, why did they pick him? He's the very first king of Israel. You know why he got picked? Ready for this? Because he was head and shoulders over everybody else. That's why he got picked. He was the tall guy. He was the big guy. And while he's sitting there, the giant, every day for 40 days, morning and evening, saying, send me a man. Everybody's looking at Saul. Saul felt a little guilty, so he said, I think I'm going to stay home, all right? He's going to stay home. And you know what he does? He becomes very fleshy. Very fleshy. How? He's going to walk by the flesh in this standpoint. Matter of fact, look what he does. He puts a bounty on Goliath's head. Look what it says in the very next statement. It says, so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who cometh up surely to defy the armies of Israel? Look at this. He's already building his legend. They're sitting around a campfire talking about this guy every night. He says, defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich him with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. Wow, that's almost worth going to fight for, right? Exemption of your taxes? And you're going to marry the king's daughter? That's what you get? He puts a bounty on his head. Anybody wants to do that? Wow. That was his solution. That was his answer. He's not going to fight him. He's waiting for somebody else to step up, and maybe God will deliver him. Look what it says in the very next statement. I want you to see David, what he says. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And as soon as David said that, his brothers jumped in and said, who do you think you are? Telling us how to fight this battle. You're just a kid. It's estimated David's probably 16 or 17 years of age. If he was 20, he'd been in the army. You're automatically in the army. It was a draft. As soon as you became 20, you're in the military. And it's interesting. Here's David, 16, 17 years old, and all he is there is to bring a meal to his brothers and to bring a little bribe to their captain so they could maybe have a weekend pass or something, you know. He brought some special things for him. But it's interesting, David's watching this, and he sees Goliath stand there and defy the nation of Israel. This huge problem. It's persistent. It's not going away. And they're trembling and they're afraid. And then he finds out sitting around a campfire that Saul, who should be out there, be the one leading the charge, has put a bounty on this guy's head, and David can't believe it. And then David says something that is absolutely incredible. Look what he says in verse 29. And David said, what have I done now? His brother's chastising him. Other guys are chastising him. Who do you think you are? You're just a kid. And David said this, is there not a cause? That's a good question. You know, there's some things worth fighting for. There's some things worth standing up against. And here this guy, this giant, this big problem who comes in, and they're dealing with it every day, and it seems like nobody's handling the problem. And David's waiting for somebody to step up and be a hero. And nobody's doing it. But we see David, he was faithful. He was faithful. Is there not a cause? He keeps asking the question over and over. What kind of cause is there? Is there a cause? Is anybody going to stand up? Well, we see the reality of the problem and the reaction. I want you to see the resources for the problem. The resources. If you're going to fight against the giant, how are you going to handle this? Look what it says in verse 31. Now, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Wow. very next verse, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. I don't want you to miss this. Remember how old David is? 16, 17 years of age. And here he says, don't let anybody's heart fail them. I mean, Saul should have been the one out there, but no, it's David here. And he says, I'm going to go and I'm going to fight against this guy. And then look what Saul says in the very next statement. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're a youth, and he's a man of war even from his youth. Let me ask you a question. Here's the resources for this problem. This is the way of the world and how they respond. And the world responds by walking by sight. When it's a big problem, they're looking at by sight. This is too big for God. We got to handle this situation. And that's what Saul was doing. He looked at David. He looked at how little he was. David's probably 150, maybe 160 pounds. Just a teenager. And here he is trying to bring comfort to the king. Don't let anybody's heart fail them because of this. We're going to take care of this. We're going to take care of this. Well, it's in here. It's interesting because Saul wants to get David ready for this battle. He's going to bless him and send him off. In his heart, I think he believes that David's a dead man. He's a dead man once he goes out there, but at least I sent somebody to go and fight. So what's he do? He acts, again, like the world, very fleshly, walking by sight. And so he takes him back to his war chest, and he gives him some weapons, and the weapons of a soldier. Matter of fact, look what it says in verse 38. It says, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Here's Saul. Every time he's been to battle, what did he do? He put on his armor. He got his sword. He put on his helmet. He's going into battle, and those are the weapons of a warrior, the weapons of a soldier. And while David is a warrior, he's not a soldier. He's not a soldier. You know what David is? David's a shepherd. That's what he is. I mean, think about it. It's kind of funny if you think about it, because Saul is head and shoulders over everybody. He's the biggest man in Israel. That's why he was picked to be the king. And he takes David into his war room, and now picture Saul. He's like a 58 long, right? And he takes this 58 long coat, puts it on David, who's a 36 Buster Brown, regular. And he's like dwarfed and all this stuff. And so he says, go get him, Tiger. David's trying to, I can't do this. I can't do this. Now that's the way of the world. That's the way of the world. Walk by sight. Weapons of a soldier. Well, what is the way of the wise? Look what it says in verse 34. The way of the wise. The way of the wise, we walk by faith. While the world walks by sight, and when they look at the problem, it's a big problem. The way of the wise, they walk by faith. And they understand we have a big God. We have a big God. I love this passage right here. In here, David's going to talk about the weapons of a shepherd. He's not going to take Saul's armor and sword and go into battle. So how's he going to do this? He's got some stories to tell. And by the way, don't ever forget the stories. I don't know if you've ever gone through some really hardships and heartache and challenges, and God has brought you through. You have a story to tell. As a pastor, I get to hear these stories all the time. And some people, they never share them, never talk about them, never deal with them. But they're great stories. They're able to give people confidence and to give them some hope and help to know that God is in complete control. And so I've learned to live my life by faith. And it's interesting because David's going to share some stories with Saul. Because Saul says, there's no way you can win this battle. He tried to dress him up, tried to get him prepared. At least he gave it his best shot. David said, I can't do this with these weapons. I can't do it with these weapons. But his confidence was in God. And so he had some stories. Matter of fact, look what it says in verse 34. It said, then David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it rose against me, I caught it by the beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be one like them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. Wow. What's David doing? He's sharing stories. I mean, he's already beat the lion, right? And he already took on the bear, and if you can beat the lions and the bears, it should be no problem taking on the giants, even if it's Sunday or Thanksgiving, whatever. Some of you will get that later. Explain it to your wife. I mean, he already fought against the bear, took out the bear, took out the lion. And he says, the same God who delivered me then is going to be the same God who delivers me when I go against this giant. When I go against this giant. And so he had confidence in God. He had a story. And friends, you need to keep those stories. You need to share those stories over and over and over again to give people confidence in their life. Because we walk by faith, not by sight. Not by sight. Well, it's interesting in this passage here. Notice what happens in verse 39. Saul tries to clothe him with his things, and David said, I can't do this. What does David have? David's a shepherd, and a shepherd has a staff, and he has a slingshot. And David says, that's how I'm going into battle. It's like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, you look small before, but to go into battle without any armor, you're going to look even smaller. And David says, these are weapons that I have used before. These are tried and proven. His confidence, he had a story. When it came to tried and proven methods, listen to this, he had a sling. He had a sling. Well, as we go down into this passage and dig in, it's kind of interesting. Verses 41 through 44, they're going to go to battle. Notice what happens in this. It's a great story. It says, verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had. And a sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So the Philistine began drawing near to David, and the man who bore his shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth. He was ruddy and good looking. That bothered him. Red-headed, young man, 16, 17 years of age, and he's just a kid. He said, send me a man, and they send him a kid. Look what it says in verse 43. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Wow. Basically, he's going after David doing a little trash talk, and here's what I'm going to do to you. Well, he can deal it out. David can give it as well. Look what then David said to the Philistine. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give your carcass to the camp of the Philistines, to the birds of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Wow. Anybody ever play sports and do a little trash talking back and forth? You know what I'm talking about? All right, appreciate that hand. I see that hand right there. Yeah, we go back and forth, tell people how good we are or whatever like that, and I remember playing basketball. This one guy, every time I tried to block his shot, as soon as he get his hand up in the air, he'd still hold it. He said, too late, and he'd shoot it. It tore me up. But it's interesting. They're going back and forth. They're getting ready to go to fight. They're getting ready to go to battle. It's interesting. Saul's looking at him, and he says, you come at me as a dog with sticks. And here's David with his staff, and he's got a slingshot, got these 5 smooth stones that are there. And David says, I don't come to you. I come to you in the name of the Lord. Come to you in the name of the Lord. Now, they're getting ready to fight. They're building this up. This is building to a crescendo right here. There's a few things in here. I'm gonna add a little that I think might have been there that maybe that God, under his inspiration, did not record in Scripture. But I'm sure that Goliath's sitting there confused. This is the guy that's coming up against me, and now he's trash talking me. He's going to deliver me. He's going to take my head off. Are you kidding me? You know, here's what I think Goliath said. By the way, anybody know how to speak giant? How do giants talk? You know what I think Goliath said? Here's what Goliath said. Fee, fi, Fi, Fo, Fum. You say, what? Well, that's how giants talk when I was growing up, right? Here's what he said. Here's what he said. When David said, I come to you in the name of the Lord, I think he was thinking, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. But he didn't know who Jehovah Sabaoth was. Have you ever studied the names of God? Have you ever looked at the names of God going through, how he's provided, how he stepped up? This is the reason David was willing to step up. He knew that he was taking God in faith, acting on his word. It's kind of interesting when you look at the names of God. Look at the Old Testament. Look at Abraham. Start off with Abraham. God challenges him to do something that's unthinkable, to offer his son up as a sacrifice. I want you to think about this. I've always thought about this, that when you talk about being a living sacrifice, Abraham takes Isaac to the mountain. They build an altar. As he lays his son on the son says, where's the sacrifice, Dad? And he says this, Jehovah Jireh. That means the Lord will provide. And God thought he was wanting him to offer his son up. He laid him on the altar. As he laid him on the altar, I'm sure tears were coming down Abraham's cheeks. And as he lifted that knife up in the air, it's interesting, the New Testament says he was convinced so much that if he killed him, God would raise him from the dead. And he took that knife, and as he had the knife in the air, a voice from heaven said, Abraham, Abraham, and he stopped him. He said, there's a ram in the thicket. And God provided miraculously. How many times have we been at the end of our rope or been at the end of ourselves, and God steps in and provides? Story after story after story. There's a great story in the book of Exodus when Moses is going into battle. They have just, the people of God had a hard time living by faith. They were worried about dying of starvation. Here, God was feeding them every day. They're worried about dying from thirst, and God was providing water all the time for them. And they just came out of one of those situations, and they're going into battle. They're getting ready to go into the land. They're going into battle, and it's interesting. As they're going into battle, they found out when they looked at Moses, Moses was holding his hands up, and while they were holding his hands up, while he was holding his hands up, they were winning the battle, and they found when Moses started letting his hands come down, he was an older guy. He's letting his hands come down. He sat down. They started to lose. As soon as Moses would stand back up, they'd start winning again. So Aaron and Hur had a deal. Let's put a stone under him so he can sit down, all right? And they held his hands up, and they won the battle. And after that, they named God's name was magnified. It was Jehovah Nissi. The Lord is my banner. The Lord is my banner. There's another story, and it's interesting. David uses the Lord of hosts in this passage right here. Goliath's trying to figure out who is the Lord of hosts. There's an interesting story in 2 Kings 6. There's a guy who succeeds Elijah. When Elijah's taken up, one of his disciples named Elisha was stepped in, take his place. And it's interesting, Elisha was a prophet of God. And anytime the nation of Syria came against Israel, it was interesting, Elijah would always tip off the king. He said, don't go here, this is what they're going to do. Or don't go there, this is what's going to happen. The Lord was revealing to Elisha that. And it's interesting because the king of Syria was so enraged that every time they went to battle that he couldn't fight them because they were always prepared or they had left or whatever. And he goes to it when he says, there's a collaborator. Somebody here is revealing those things to the nation of Israel. And one of his wise men said, there's not a collaborator, there's a prophet in Israel. He's a prophet of God, and he's revealing him these secrets. Well, where's he at? He said, let's find out. They found out he was in Dothan. And when he went to Dothan, it's interesting, Elisha was spending the night in Dothan with one of his disciples. And while they were there, Syria sent their army there, and they encamped around them. The next day, his disciple got up, and he walked out. And as he walked out and began to stretch, he looked up, and there's the Syria army right there. Oh, my goodness. He knows what's going to happen. He goes back in. He wakes Elisha up, says, hey, I got some bad news. He said, what is it? We're going to die. We're going to die. What do you mean? What do you mean? Go out and look. The army of Syria is out there. We're going to die. Elisha goes out, and Elisha's looking and says, I got them right where I want them. This guy goes, what? What? And Elisha says, Lord, open this disciple's eyes. And he opened his eyes. He was walking by sight rather than by faith. And when he opened his eyes, he saw exactly the same thing that David had saw. The armies of the Lord, the host of heaven, Jehovah Sabaoth. And he looked at Elisha and says, there's more of us than there is of them. He says, exactly. And God delivered them. But here's David. And he's dealing with this situation right here. And notice what happens, the very next statement. And look what it says in verse 48. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead so that the stone sank into his forehead and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. Wow. And then, by the way, David fulfilled what he said he was going to do. He went over. You know what's interesting? The nation of Israel, after that, they had courage. Now they had confidence. Let's go, right? Let's go get them. And it started with a young boy who learned to live by faith. He was a warrior by faith. And the battle was the Lord's. As soon as David let that rock go, it was in the hands of God. You know, some people look at, man, he went up against a giant. I think David had the confidence of, like, how can I miss this guy? He's so big, right? He's so big. And while they were focused on the bigness of their problem, David focused on the bigness of God. He serves a big God. A big God. Well, in here, let's talk about the response to the problem. There are 3 takeaways, I think, in this passage here. After they won the battle, they chased them, pursued them, and defeated their enemies. And David became a hero overnight. The response to the problem. So what do you do when you face big giants, big problems, whether they're physical or spiritual problems? How do you handle those? Well, it's the same way David dealt with this problem. First of all, you got to live by faith, not by sight. You walk by faith, not by sight. First of all, accept the problem. Accept the problem. They were hoping it would go away, right? For 40 days. He came every morning and every night just to remind them, I'm still here. The problem was not going away. Accept the problem. The second thing, believe on God. Not just believe in God, believe on God. Say, what's the difference? It's interesting. There's a verse in Psalm 37, verse 5. It says this. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Did you get that? Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Pretty much God's got this. Are you willing to believe that God has this? It's interesting, the word there for commit. I have several grandchildren, and I got one, Otis. He's as wild as all get out, right? He has a little brother by the name of Felix. And Otis is 3 years old, but you know what he likes to do? He likes to carry Felix around. Now, my daughter was getting upset. Even my wife was getting upset with this. You know, you can't let Otis try to carry Felix. He's going to drop him. He's going to drop him. So my daughter's always getting onto him and stuff. He's 3 years old and he's carrying his little. Now, I'll tell you what, Felix has gotten a lot bigger since then, okay? But he was always trying to pick him up and carry him. And I read a story here of a lady who kept getting onto her son. He was picking his little brother up and carrying him into the room, and she was scared. The same thing. Thought he's going to drop him. He's going to drop him and hurt him. And she said, honey, if I see you if you carry your brother around one more time, I'm going to discipline you. He said, really? She said, yes. About that time, she got a phone call. She went into the next room and took the phone call and was talking. After she got done, she hung up. She went back to the room, and neither one of her boys were in there. And she went down the hallway, and the little boy was standing there. And the mother said, there's your brother? She said, you're going to get disciplined. I told you not to do that. He said, what? You told me not to carry him. She said, how did he get here? He said this, I rolled him. That's acceptable. I rolled him. I love this Hebrew word that's used right here. In Psalm 37:5, go back to that verse if you don't mind. It says, commit your way to the Lord. The word commit. It's made up of 2 Hebrew words. And basically it means this, roll yourself upon the Lord. Have you ever had a problem that just is so overwhelming you can't take it anymore? it seems like you're beat down and you can't carry it. And God says, you know what? Bring it to me. Bring it to me. Give it to me. That's what the word commit means. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also. Trust is the same word for faith. Trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. We accept the problem, believe on God, and then charge your problem. Go after it. Whether it's a problem or a fear, go after it. You know, it's interesting in here, when David asked the question, that's the same question I'd like to ask each and every one of us today. The question is this: is there not a cause? I'm pretty excited about what God's doing in our church. Some of the challenges we found out are that we need people that can help us, workers, volunteers. And everybody, someday, one day, they're going to volunteer. They're going to get around to it. And they keep waiting, putting off. And maybe God says, you know what? How about today? Is there not a cause? You know, I had a person say one time, you know, we just don't have enough volunteers, and I said, or enough workers. And I said, no, that's not true. We got plenty of workers. It's just whether people are willing to step up and do what God has called them to do. We got to figure, is there a cause? There's an absolute cause. And it makes all the difference in the world. You say, well, I got these problems. Walk by faith, not by. Let's pray together.